Welcome back to ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. Today, keeping the world company. We're going to talk about Ukraine with Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. And we're going to talk about how the battlefield has changed because there's a moving target. I hate to use that term. It's a moving target. And let me ask the general question first, Carl. What's going on?
Well, I think generally, the conflict is turning into a stalemate. It reminds me so much of Korea from 51 to 53, where today you see a story about Russia attacking the north. The next day you see a story about Ukraine retaking something close to Bakhmut. And so I think what you're seeing is the beginning of a long-term stalemate. And when you look at outside observers, people are talking about, can Ukraine win the long war? How sustainable is the European or Western support for Ukraine? Can Russia withstand a long war? And so all the commentary, all the actions on the ground are starting to look like a longer war, number one. Number two, what you're seeing is a broadening of the war, where it's not just trench warfare in eastern Ukraine anymore. Now it's Ukraine attacking the perimeter in the Russian cities, attempts to attack Moscow, and in the meantime, you see, Russia attacking Odessa, Kyiv. Even a month ago or so, I saw that they were attacking Lviv. So it's broadening out on basically a stalemated kind of conflict where each side is trying to attrit the other in a very long-term conflict.
Who does that favor?
Well, I think it favors Russia. I mean, Ukraine is the smaller power. Russia has a lot of resources to draw on. And Ukraine is ultimately dependent on the somewhat fickle nature of democracies in the West.
Yeah, can we talk about fickle for a minute? My information is incomplete, but I recall hearing that Germany is not so supportive as it was. The U.S. is still, thank you, Joe Biden, the U.S. is still dragging its heels on the F-16s. And he's running into trouble politically because the GOP seems to be hardening its position against supporting Ukraine. The UK and its new prime minister not so excited about Ukraine. And there are other issues. You know how the fickle finger of the media works. There are other issues that come up and distract us from the passion that we had now 500 days ago about supporting Ukraine. Fate intervenes, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That's why ultimately democracies have a domestic base that grows weary of foreign intervention. How many times must we prove this to ourselves before we realize that you really need to act on that fickleness, if you will?
But the ultimate stakes haven't changed. You and I have been talking about this since it began. And the ultimate stakes are the liberal world order, the future of democracy, how well autocrats are doing. I mean, it's all connected somehow, and it's connected to politics in this country too.
Mm-hmm.
So that hasn't changed, but the parameters of win, lose, draw, those have changed. This is of great concern, isn't it?
Well, it should be. It should be to everybody. And I think, as much as, I've been sort of on the other side of it with you about, the survival of democracy and the liberal order and all that, because my view is still that, diplomacy is a better option than a stalemated killing everybody until we can't anymore. And so my view is that we really need to start thinking about what is our end game of a world that has Russia still there at the end and Ukraine there at least as a somewhat independent country. So I think, we need to start thinking in terms of how do we deter Russia in the long term in the context of some sort of peace agreement, some sort of peace settlement that falls short of Zelensky's, broader idea that he's going to retake all of Ukraine's original territory, including Crimea.
But there are some pathologicals who can't negotiate. They're just constitutionally unable to negotiate. They will always lie and cheat and do strategies that will move to their advantage instead of actually reach a settlement. I wouldn't say that except for the fact that I practiced law for several decades, and most lawyers would like to settle. Most clients would like to settle, but there are some, and I would treat them as pathological, who never settle, who will never settle on any terms, even if those terms are attractive. And that's what we have in Putin.
Well, but you have this, but yes, you have that in Putin, but you also have that in Zelensky, I'm afraid, that he's starting to look the same way, because I just don't think that you know retaking Crimea is something that's going to be very easily done in a short period of time. And that's always been his sticking point, is that he thinks that Crimea has to be back under Ukraine sovereignty. And one of the things, of course, that's happening in the war, as we said, it's changed. But one of the things I didn't mention there is that Crimea seems to be a big focus of his attention. So he's doing a lot of attacks, trying to figure out how to retake Crimea. And I think that is ultimately wasted resources in the context of trying to reach a point where Putin will negotiate. We will have lines of control. And I know that's not a very satisfactory answer for someone who wants total victory. But what I'm saying is this frozen conflict, or not the frozen conflict, but the stalemated conflict, while killing goes on, is not very advantageous to Ukrainians' cause.
I agree about the killing, of course, but let me offer a thought to you, and I have no inside knowledge on this, but Zelensky may be doing this to deal with the pathology that I spoke of, and that he's trying to get a leg up on it so he can get to a point where he can have sufficient advantage to make a deal. And if I were involved, as I mentioned, in counsel, in circumstances of counsel with somebody who's very hard to negotiate with, I would do that too. I would keep on pushing until I got to a point where I knew I had his attention. And I suggest to you, Carl, that's exactly what Zelensky is doing.
I hope you're right. I mean, I hope that is actually what's happening. It's hard, again, from the outsider looking in, it's hard to see that that's the case. And so you said it's speculation, and I hope that that's correct. I mean, I hope that that's really what's happening, because again, I'll go back and do the comparison to Korea. This is sort of, it feels so much like 1952. That we're just really just trading bodies at this point, and ultimately that's not sustainable. And so I think what I was trying to suggest is what we need to start thinking about is, how do you deter the pathological killer in Putin from taking advantage of the settlement that needs to happen? And so I hope you're right. I hope that this really is what Zelensky is doing, and that at some point we get to the point where Putin recognizes that there has to be a settlement, because a settlement, even though it's not satisfactory in terms of the absolutes of democracy and liberal order and all that, it does buy time. And at this point, I think we need to buy time, even though it's going to allow Russia to replenish. It also allows us and the Ukrainians to replenish the will to maintain Ukraine as a sovereign state.
Yeah, there are so many, what shall I say, discordant distractions that are in play here, and you don't know which one of them will rise up and bite. I worry about the ones that would rise up and bite Zelensky, but there are also things that would rise up and bite Putin. So let's talk about some of the factors that have been in play where they might have a salient effect going forward. And one of them, I think, of great interest is Prigozhin. That rebellion was not good for Putin, no matter how you cut it. And Putin's assassination of Prigozhin, I don't think that was good for Putin at all. But what do you think? How does all of that affect Putin's position, his ability to galvanize the country?
My view is that what you say was not good for Putin, I would say was not good for Russia, because it really demonstrates the weakness of the Russian state. I think for Putin, it made the clear statement with the Prigozhin shooting down or not shooting down, but eliminating Prigozhin, however you want to describe that incident with the airplane, was certainly for Putin was a demonstration that he is in control in Russia. So it scares off any opposition within Russia. But in the eyes of the world, you have to believe that this was not good for Putin, and it certainly doesn't help his cause in recruiting people to go to Ukraine in the context of Ukraine. So I think Prigozhin is symptomatic of Putin's problem with how do you maintain control in Russia while you prosecute this war. So that's sort of my view on what Prigozhin is. But Prigozhin more broadly, the Wagner Group in Bakhmut demonstrated that Putin does have the ability to apply force where he needs it in the Ukrainian conflict. So, Prigozhin broadly is more of a Russian problem in the context of the rest of the world. Now that he's gone, the whole Wagner network in the Middle East and Africa is something that's going to distract Russia from its focus on Ukraine. So I'll stop with that and say that I think that's really the Prigozhin effect, is that it's distracted Russia a bit from the main focus on the war with Ukraine.
Well, in having him killed, Putin took out the middleman, and now he's got arguably the Wagner Group in the army. They were Russian troops essentially, and now he's taken command of them. On the other hand, what's missing is Prigozhin, who's a good leader. I mean, as far as their dastardly acts were concerned. Query: will they be as effective as members of the Russian army? I mean, the general consensus seems to be that the Russian army is flawed. It's top down, not bottom up, and it doesn't allow for creative fighting. The result is that they have not performed very well. And now, under Putin, they are not likely to perform as well as they performed under Prigozhin. Either, in Africa, I absolutely agree about that, but also in the Donbass.
Yeah, I agree, but to me, it's not quite clear yet whether Putin, the military, whoever official Russia has actually taken the Wagner Group. I think there's still some competition at lower levels to actually influence some of the activities of the Wagner activities. So I mean, what I think is a potential is that you see a splintering of the Wagner Group, that it's not as effective as a whole organization, that there's pockets that become less effective, and then it's a matter of sorting out where those pockets of effectiveness and ineffectiveness are.
Now, he's going to try to break them up. He's going to try to spread them out through the Russian army somehow, because he doesn't want that to happen again. But let me say, in terms of galvanizing the army, the Russian public, right now my latest reading is that he is looking for deserters or people who don't want to go back to the front. And when he finds them, he sends them to jail. This is not good for morale, but query whether it meets his goals.
No, that's why I say ultimately it's not good for the Russian state more than it's not good for Putin, because Putin seems to be in a position where he can still manipulate the Russian public, but ultimately Putin's advantage becomes Russia's disadvantage.
You talk about attrition, talk about a long war, and if you asked me 90 days ago, maybe 120, what made it a long war, I would say, gee, this sounds like World War I. It sounds like trench warfare, where you figure out how to kill the guy in the trench, and he figures out how not to get killed in the trench, and that could last forever. Think of with the Maginot Line and all the trench warfare in 1917 and 18. But it seems like that has been overtaken by events, more specifically by technology. You talk about drones. Drones are drones are the technological statement of this war, and they make trench warfare less less relevant, don't they?
Well, I wouldn't say they make it less relevant, but they certainly complement trench warfare. So, in some ways, with the drones, the way I see it is you still have the trench warfare where I'm killing you with a rifle and you're killing me with a rifle. But what you have is you extend it beyond the trench on the front line, because what these drone attacks represent is really the opportunity to go take out little pieces beyond the trench. So you have the attacks on Kyiv, and they're killing people, but they're killing people that it's not going to matter in the long term, but it matters in that it makes life uncomfortable in areas beyond the trenches. So I would say I would recharacterize it, the drones, as being an extension of trench warfare. That it's individual killings that are not going to change the ultimate outcome of the war as much as they are to just make the war more miserable for more people.
What effect does this drone play, like destroying Russian aircraft on the tarmac, destroying Russian buildings, including buildings in Moscow, on what appears now to be a regular basis? Does this have an effect on the Russian state? Does it have an effect on the morale of the Ukrainians? Does it have an effect on people outside, like in Western Europe, in the United States, about the Ukrainians, about their strength, their technology, what have you? Or is it all a big mistake?
As I said, it's really sort of the extension of trench warfare to affect more people, and more people see the trench warfare. And so I think all those sentiments about the futility of trench warfare are just broadened out. So I would answer it that way. But I think another point, the point that I want to pick up in what you're saying, is what it also does is it also risks the threat of broadening the war, because by attacking Russian territory, this is what the Biden administration has been so concerned about, is what if we start using American weapons to attack Russian territory? This has always been the concern. And I saw in the news recently, that said the Russians were accusing the Ukrainians of using cluster bombs that they got from the West to attack these perimeter cities in Russia. And so that to me is an effect that could become very important when we start talking about, again, the concern of broadening it, the concern of NATO involvement. If we move up towards Kaliningrad, and the little path that allows you to go from Poland to Lithuania, if Russia or Belarus Russia via Belarus decides to try to take that territory, that little neck that separates Kaliningrad from Belarus, then we have NATO involvement, and now you have attacks in Russia, and pretty soon are you going to start seeing attacks on NATO, Poland, Lithuania specifically territory by the Russians, where now you start risking again the real underlying concern of the Biden administration is, do you now have NATO involvement and American versus Russia involvement, or NATO versus Russia?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Russians are complaining about the cluster bombs. They also use cluster bombs. They've used cluster bombs before the Ukrainians got cluster bombs. And they've been using Iranian drones.
Sure.
They've been getting weapons everywhere they can. They're using drones from China, for that matter. But going to Kaliningrad and all that whole area is like a tinderbox as far as I can see. You have Belarus, which is turning more and more pro-Russia and more and more repressive on its own people. You have Poland, which is really scared. Lithuania, Latvia, they're really scared now. And Russia has got these agents that try to disrupt and foment divisiveness in these countries, as well as the countries to the south, like Moldova. And so what you have is a spreading of the war through these asymmetrical activities, especially by Russia. Don't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another aspect of the technology piece is and that's cyber warfare. that's disinformation. It's throwing out the idea that Ukraine is using the cluster bombs on Russian territory for the very purpose of trying to foment more dislike for Ukraine, for more justification for attacking NATO territory, for using more lethal weapons, for moving nuclear weapons into Belarus. All that is part of that technological piling on that you get beyond what we saw in old day trench warfare, where the only people that really saw it and were affected by it were the people living close to the trenches.
Yeah, so at least for Putin, and I suppose to some extent for Zelensky too, this is a war beyond the kinetic war. It is a war of propaganda.
Mhm.
It is a war for public opinion in Western Europe and in the United States.
Sure.
I am struck by the fact that Tucker Carlson, who is one of my personal unfavorite people in the world, had an interview with Viktor Orban, who is also one of my unfavorite people in the world, where the two of them agreed in no uncertain terms that the United States should immediately stop supporting Ukraine. Thank you, Tucker. That's real helpful. And so what you get is that kind of propaganda. And if it's happening in Hungary, it's happening here. And I think Putin is doing propaganda here, directly or indirectly, social media, what have you, to try to turn at least the Republican Party against supporting Ukraine. And this is happening, it seems to me, at an increasing rate. Do you see the same?
Yeah, I see the same. And remember, the Republican debate for, I guess we could say, vice president or something recently. There were two candidates that put their hands up in the air when they said, should we stop supporting Ukraine? So yeah, it is a growing, and there is this effort to provide that sort of impetus in the United States to be against continuing the war in Ukraine. And I think the same thing is occurring in Germany and the rest of Europe. And yeah, Orban has been a problem, and there's other people, not just Orban, but there's been other people in Europe who have been pushing for this same thing, that we can't indefinitely support Ukraine.
You didn't mention Macron.
I wouldn't put him quite in the same place as Orban, but he certainly is further on that side of the scale than say Biden in the United States.
Carl, if you compare the ardor of the EU to support Ukraine, say a year ago, when it was fresh, when we didn't have this kind of moral fatigue, I call it moral fatigue, things were very different. They were talking the rhetoric that supported Ukraine, and to a large extent, they were following through. But you don't have that now. The needle is turning. And the fickle finger of media is turning. The propaganda is growing. And I'm saying to myself, that ultimately will determine the outcome here. And that is not encouraging. What do you think?
No, it's not. And in fact, I think it was yesterday I saw on the news that, sort of quietly, Europe increased the import of liquefied natural gas 40% over the last year.
From Russia.
From Russia. Yeah. So ships, they're not getting it through the pipelines anymore, but they are getting it through ships. So they're now that the ships are bringing LNG into Europe. So that it's not just the information, but it's also an economic reality that Europe is quietly going back to using the Russian resources. I think the EU, the support in the EU is fading because of fatigue and personal national interests or local national interests.
So, Carl, you're a diplomat, and you have followed this your whole career in terms of the American foreign policy, diplomatic policy. Mm-hmm. Here we are in a strange circumstance, because the political interests in the country are not in agreement, and there's a growing opposition to supporting Ukraine. What in the world does the State Department do? What does Joe Biden do in order to, do the moral, ethical thing? It seems to be getting harder.
It really is a difficult question to answer, and I think the United States has tried to be faithful in providing the support. You're critical of Biden with the F-16s. I mean, I view the F-16s as a bit of a red herring, in the sense that it's a long-term prospect of training people, of getting F-16s on the ground in Ukraine and actually have them be usable. So I think, like I said, I think they're doing everything they can in the political context of American politics, but it's very difficult to support Zelensky to me, it's very difficult to support Zelensky as long as he is simply unwilling to negotiate. He's taken the hard line, saying, I refuse to negotiate. Now, if in fact what you say is true, that he's just moving toward a position of extracting the best outcome he can, that's great. But at some point, there needs to be some recognition that the ability of the ability of the United States and others to continue to support him is waning. Then there needs to be a very careful conversation between Ukraine, Zelensky, and Biden, or whoever is the current president, whatever the current administration is in the United States, to come to some level of agreement that there's a point where we have to begin serious negotiations, or at least serious consideration for what we are willing to settle for. And I just don't know that that's happening yet.
You really wonder, from what you say, you really wonder whether the State Department is in talks with him now, I mean, quietly, to suggest negotiating strategies, because that's what this really ultimately could be about. But we live in a goldfish bowl, and whatever you say has a way of getting out. So that kind of advice could be misused and of no effect, or worse.
Yeah, and I think that's the big risk. And so there may well be some level of discussion along those lines. And I think that's in my mind where we are today. That's the best that we can do as far as the United States and other Europeans. I think the UK is still very much supportive of Ukraine, and not to the level that it was, but again, I think they're more closely aligned with the United States than say Germany or France.
Knock wood. Well, a couple of other things that we ought to cover. One is I mentioned to you before the show that I'm following Mark Hamill of Star Wars fame, who is on his own motion organizing a fundraising and drone raising website and publicity to try to get people in this country to support the purchase of drones by the Ukrainian Department of Defense, and in fact to send drones in like kind to the Ukrainian Department of Defense. And I think he's getting a substantial response from people in this country who, forgetting government now, they just want to help Ukraine out. So you have, what do you want to call it? Kind of an NGO, an NGO.
Sort of a GoFundMe drone program or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know where that's going to go, but, it's worth mentioning, and it's a factor. The other factor is Elon Musk, who has controlled, Starlink satellite internet system on which Ukraine has relied for most of the war. But more recently, he has said, I'm not doing that free anymore. I'm going to charge the United States government for Starlink. But, the problem is that, A, he's charging them a lot, and B, he's a private operator. And so if he decides to increase the price or make it impossible or terminate the service, he could control a significant aspect of intelligence and operations for Ukraine. Again, like Mark Hamill, this is an individual person who rolls up his sleeve and gets involved. And I do not feel that Elon Musk has the same moral fiber as Mark Hamill, but there he is with a tremendous amount of power. It's Dr. No, come current.
Yeah. I mean, since we're naming unfavored people, I guess I will put him in that category from my perspective. But it's an interesting point that it's well beyond just government's involvement. There's any number of people who are involved, engaged on a personal level, and of course, if you have resources and energy like Mark Hamill or Elon Musk, you can make a big impact on something like this. And yeah, individuals are. If you think populations are fickle, well, individuals are even more fickle because they can make decisions overnight and it changes. So, yeah, it's sort of an interesting side of this modern day war. Given that we thought we were all done with trench warfare, it's interesting, I guess, in a sad sort of way, to see how this, again, technology and modern communications actually influence how we perceive and what we can actually do to influence the outcome of this conflict in Eastern Europe.
We've named, and I think if we spent a little more time, we could name another dozen factors and influences on the outcome. And when you take all those factors, influences, and people who have a lot of power, one way or the other, then you are really looking at a fickle result. And anything could emerge. Any of those things and more could emerge, completely shift, the direction of this, the needle on the compass, to some other result. Very troubling, because that's not necessarily driven by saving the liberal world order. But let me ask you this. It's always my favorite final question. What's the timing on this? If Joe Biden, said, I'm going to give you F-16s, and then he drags his heels for 500 days now, and then he's still dragging his heels on the F-16. In fact, he's blocking the F-16. They're not going to see F-16s in operation for another year. And so it raises the question of how important is time here? How much time do we have before this all implodes one way or the other, most likely with the failure of Ukraine?
It's hard. I mean, that really is almost an impossible question to answer at this point, I think. Realistically, you can do trench warfare for a long time. Even the modern version of trench warfare. I would say 2 years. I mean, that's saying, we could be in this kind of situation for 2 years without a lot of things changing. I think everything is fairly set in place. Everybody has sort of grown accustomed to the idea that people in Eastern Europe are killing each other. They're bombing each other's cities, and we've all sort of come to accept that. I mean, that's the sad part of these kinds of conflicts, is they become routine for the rest of the world because you're not visibly and personally affected by it. And so, I think it could very easily go on for 2 years with no change at all. And that's why I see it as a stalemated conflict. But I think, if you stretch beyond that, then you really do begin to feel the effects of the fatigue, and you begin to see, like you say, these sort of unexpected events. I mean, what if Zelensky is killed? What if Putin falls out of a window? What happens then? Then you have a whole dynamic that changes, because you have the leadership absence of someone who has really been the face and the personality of this war. So it could go on, and so what I'm saying is, it could, next week it could change based on some exogenous event that actually changes the nature of the conflict.
Yeah, and what is happening all through this game now, and certainly on an increasing basis over the next couple of years, is climate change. And it's getting tougher and rougher all around. A good part of Siberia is leaking methane gas at an extraordinary rate into the atmosphere. Very dangerous gas for climate change. And we have had our floods, our fires, we know here in Hawaii for sure, that come from nowhere. And all of a sudden, huge destruction and displacement. This will happen on an increasing basis, and it could happen, in such measure that we really have to pay attention to it, which we are not doing at all.
Well, that's right. And that what you say just reminded me. One of the things we haven't talked about that's sort of gone quiet, is this threat of a nuclear incident at Zaporizhzhia. I mean, that certainly is something that would change the dynamic dramatically, because suddenly you'd have, basically have a contamination problem that affects everybody.
Well, Carl, it's almost time for me to go and soak my head now. Thank you for this uplifting discussion.
Well, we knew it wasn't going to be uplifting, because it really is a sad story that is we've let it become routine, and that is a sad state of affairs, I think.
Yeah, it is the new normal.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Carl Baker, Senior Advisor for Pacific Forum, for this very interesting and important discussion. I hope to circle back with you and check it out in a few weeks.
Thanks, Jay.
Aloha.